Japan up close.
Human rights feature prominently in the United Nations Charter, so I'd like to start with that. And among the goals of the United Nations, there are solving of humanitarian problems, promotion of universal human rights. And also in the preamble of the United Nations Charter, United Nations promised to prevent future wars, future suffering. Unfortunately, at the very beginning, during the Cold War, Security Council didn't deal with human rights too often because of some problems with interpretation, what was human rights relations to state sovereignty. And of course, it was one of the topic in this Cold War competition. But in the 80s and 90s, unfortunately, a lot of internal conflicts appeared. And human rights violations were a part of consequences, sometimes reasons why those conflicts appeared. So in 1991, the Security Council admitted for the first time that serious mass violations of human rights can be the first sign of future conflict. And of course, this link between security and human rights became obvious. So in the 90s, more and more often, Security Council referred to human rights problems. For example, in Iraq, in Somalia, of course, in Balkan wars. And what was also important that the Security Council started cooperation with some other United Nations human rights bodies and institutions. For example, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, he was a Special Rapporteur of UN Commission on Human Rights for Balkan Wars. He was invited by Security Council to present his results, his reports. So it was a huge breakthrough. And another breakthrough moment was 2005, when the General Assembly accepted the concept of responsibility to protect. So the concept that states and international community are responsible to prevent and to react on this worst, most serious human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide. And the Security Council played the most important role to promote that idea. And very often in its resolutions, Security Council appealed to states to protect their populations. So, generally speaking, my opinion is positive about the progress which has been made after the Second World War. But of course, it doesn't mean that there are no problems to be resolved. Unfortunately, examples of many states, many wars show that more efforts have to be done. Currently, there are more than 300 million people in need. So it means they need international humanitarian aid. I follow the situation and I can see that every year there are additional 40 million people in need. So it's the population of Poland, for example. So during the Second World War, there were 50 million of refugees. Today, even more than 100 million refugees. So it's an enormous challenge for states and international community. I believe there should be better burden sharing because today around 20 states fund more than 90% of humanitarian aid. So for sure, we need more states to be involved in that situation. And also Ukraine was mentioned. Of course, Ukraine is an example of a regular war, which was started by Russian aggression against Ukraine. And we observe really dire situation of refugees, displaced persons. Every day there are new information about war crimes, maybe also crimes against humanity. It is investigated, but it is just the regular war. In Europe, there are 7.5 million refugees, Ukrainian refugees. In Poland, 1.5 million. But generally speaking, according to United Nations, around 17 million people in Ukraine are in need of humanitarian aid. So it is a huge challenge for Europe and for the United Nations. The head of Security Council are permanent members, 5 permanent members with the right to veto decisions. And of course, that system doesn't work, especially when the Parliament Council's member is involved in some security situation problems. If there are some interests which were formulated or not, or executed by permanent members, there is the problem for international peace and security. So especially in the Ukrainian case, it can be a good moment to start to come back to the discussion about the reform of the United Nations. Because currently we very often hear that question, Human Security Council, what for? It's completely dysfunctional right now. So I can see 3 problems to be resolved here. The first one is that, of course, Security Council doesn't reflect diversity, complexity of the world. There are some continents as South America or Africa, which are not represented in the Security Council. And there are states as Japan, India, Brazil, which have quite high GDP, which are quite influential, but they have no impact on Security Council's decisions. So it's good time to restart the discussion. Another problem which should be resolved is, of course, the decision-making process and the veto system, because especially when human rights are seriously violated, when there is a genocide, crimes against humanity are committed, it's hard to imagine that just one state can block decisions and international community's engagement. And finally, the last problem is what should be done with permanent members of the Security Council, which obviously violate the very basic principles of the United Nations. You know, when the state attack another one, when territorial integrity, sovereignty are just violated, it is a situation which has an impact for the whole Security Council and for the whole United Nations. So probably international community should find the solution for that situation. Because the situation that Security Council is not able to take any decisions, permanent members violate the very basic principles, unfortunately build distrust against the United Nations, and just this is the cause for the crisis of multilateralism, and especially for smaller states, medium-sized states, it's a not good situation. And Japan has huge experience as a non-permanent and Security Council's member, and it's quite consistent in its approach to human rights, rule of law. It was very active to promote the idea of human security, responsibility to protect. So it is a reliable, non-permanent Security Council's member. The protection of human rights is the responsibility of the whole world, all states and international community as well. Moreover, the rule of law is the condition for maintaining the peace and security. So I find it very positive that Japan initiated the discussion in the Security Council. It organized the open discussion about the rule of law. The rule of law is important for states, for internal policy. It is important to avoid, to prevent corruption, to prevent discrimination, to prevent human rights violations. But it is also important for international arena, because the rule of law, when it is respected, we can trust states and international community, and especially today when we observe in Ukraine violation of jus ad bellum and jus in bello, basic principles of international humanitarian law is violated. Sometimes crimes, war crimes, seems to be a tool of war. So we need to come back to those problems. And since the 90s, more or less, we can be satisfied with standards which were adopted and achieved by the United Nations, I mean human rights standards, but all the time we observe a huge gap between standards and the implementation. And that's why the discussion about implementation of human rights, granting rule of law is absolutely crucial. The G4 nations, so Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, support each other when we talk about being a part of Security Council as a non-permanent members, or in the future maybe permanent members. As I mentioned before, I think there is a moment to come back to the discussion. I'm not convinced that only those 4 states should be taken into account. Maybe also some African state or African Union could send the representative to Security Council. In Europe, there is the discussion about the European Union instead of Germany. But it's positive that we discuss about the issue. For me, there are several important questions. The first one is criteria. It's not only about power and the position in the world, but especially permanent members of the Security Council should be responsible states. They should respect human rights, rule of law. They shouldn't violate basic principles of international law. So it is something that should be taken into account. Then, of course, the question of decision-making process and veto. The problem is, when we talk about the reform, that current 5 permanent members probably would oppose any reform. And they would keep the veto system, and they want to protect their interests. So it can be really challenging. But I believe in the situation that the permanent member violates international law, there should be a procedure for that kind of situations. And some basic principles of international law should be implemented here. But for example, nobody should be a judge in its own case. So maybe I don't believe in eliminating the veto, but for sure it should be limited. And it should be limited when there is a genocide, when crimes against humanity, war crimes are committed. And the second situation for me, when permanent member violates international law in such a way. Another question is how to reform the United Nations. There is the United Nations Charter. It was ratified by all states in the world. So there are 2 options: to revise UN Charter or to adopt a completely new document. And some years ago, during the last serious discussion about the United Nations reform, also Poland was engaged in the discussion. Poland proposed completely new political act for the United Nations, taking into account that basic principles, basic values, goals included in UN Charter are really good and should be a good sign and should show the way in which international community go. So we probably should discuss a new document, a new political act for the United Nations. We should maybe reformulate some values, some principles, and for sure we should include new institutions, new procedures. It will be difficult, but if there is a will, there is a way.
Japan up close.